This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Minister, Happy New Year. Thanks for being here. On what date will your government bring forward legislation to fix Bill C-69, which has been unconstitutional for half a decade?
When you say Bill C-69, which of the three laws are you? Which of the three laws are you referring to?
Half-a-decade-old unconstitutional Impact Assessment Act.
So the Impact Assessment Act. Okay. So we will, as we've said, we will be bringing forward targeted amendments within the next number of months to address.
108 days ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the Impact Assessment Act is largely unconstitutional. So on what?
Well, that's not what the Supreme Court said.
It absolutely
no, that's not what the Supreme Court said. But what we have said is we respect the decision of the Supreme Court, and we will be bringing forward targeted amendments in the next few months.
On what date? In
the next few months.
Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister. Just to make sure everybody is clear, because there's a lot of statements been made here, as a Nova Scotia MP and a member of the Conservative Caucus, we support the development of offshore wind if it's economical and works and does not displace existing important industries like our commercial fishery. And we don't support the imposition of the C-69 processes on the development of all offshore energy off of Nova Scotia. And you mentioned and said that the new processes from C-69 that are in this bill only apply to the review of offshore wind. But that's not the way I read the bill or the way most people see the bill. It's a new process for reviewing all offshore energy projects. These two boards will not be following the process that they follow now for offshore oil and gas or for wind. They'll be following the C-69 process. Is that not true through the IAA?
Again, C-69 had three pieces of legislation under it. So you are referring then to the Impact Assessment Act and not the Navigable Waters Act and not the Canadian Energy Regulator Act. Okay. So as I have said, the focus of the offshore boards has always been on a process to assess initially hydrocarbon projects. It will now actually be expanded to address renewable energy projects. The process that is being put into place is something that we have worked very closely with Premier Houston, who you would know very well.
I understand that, Minister, but sorry to interrupt. Minister, I only have 5 minutes, and I asked a very specific question. I don't need another explanation on your discussion with the province. I asked a question about whether or not the process that's in C-49 applies to both the oil and gas energy project review process and the offshore wind project, because that's the way the bill reads. And you said it doesn't.
So I didn't say it doesn't. There are some differences, but certainly the way the regulator actually goes through the project approval process will be similar.
Okay, so even before this process, and that process we know has resulted in almost no energy projects being approved since C-69 has been implemented. So you're going to take that and apply it not only to offshore oil and gas, but also that cumbersome and awful process to offshore wind. And even without that, in November, a proposal for an exploratory well off of Nova Scotia was suspended for you after approval by this board and then rejected. And in the 30 days in between in the media, you said in your decision to whether or not to veto this, you needed to talk to interest groups like the Sierra Club. Did you talk to anyone else besides the Sierra Club?
Sure, there were a number of different organizations that we talked to, and I certainly talked to my counterpart, Minister Rushton, and we made the decision jointly.
Did you speak with any fishing groups? There were
folks from the fishing community in some of the meetings. Yep.
So I'd like to take you back, because one of the things this bill does in Section 28, I believe it is it gives an enormous power to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to say you cannot do any offshore energy project, any offshore, including wind, if they may be thinking about a marine protected area. And you'll recall when you were fisheries minister, your visit to the Eastern Shore, where 200 lobster fishermen came in to greet you on the area of interest off the Eastern Shore, which you'll recall is this area right here that was set up in 2018. You were about to turn it into a marine protected area at the time, and the objections of the community, because nobody had been consulted, and none of those people have been consulted in any of the offshore wind projects to date, and in the consultation of this bill, they push back on you because there have been no socioeconomic stuff, because you are going to impose that in an area where they have few opportunities to make a living other than lobster, mackerel, and herring. And you are going to close it down. Now, you suspended that, but that Damocles sword is still hanging over everybody, and that's what DFO does. And you've given them that power in this bill to stop everything in the ocean that you want to do on offshore energy. Why would you do that?
That's not actually what the bill does. So there is no ability for DFO or for the federal government to create a marine protected area on its own. It requires, under the Accord Acts, agreement on the part of both the province and the federal government. That's part of the structure of the Accord Acts.
It says may. It may be identified, not it is.
You can identify something as
without actually doing the process.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. Thank you, Minister. The time's up.
And I'll let the Honourable Minister know that the Conservative Party opposes this bill because Bill C-49 breaks the spirit of the original Atlantic Accord. So much so that the Canadian Association of Petroleum, and I
Point of order.
I'm pleased that I humored my colleague from Labrador.
Mr. Small, I'll ask you to hold 1 sec. We have a point of order from Mr. Angus.
So the statement that they're officially opposing Bill C-49, is that just his opinion, or is that the Conservative Party? So it helps us understand where we're going with these guys.
So colleagues,
just tell
hold on, colleagues. Once again, I'll encourage all colleagues to make sure your point of order is a point of order relevant to the conversation.
We voted against
and not make sure we don't use it as debate, but I will also ask all members to stay in line with their questioning. So, Mr. Small, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I hope that time goes back onto my time, respectfully. So we oppose this legislation. We voted for it. Obviously, we oppose it. And we oppose it because the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers wrote you a letter, and I have it right here. I don't know if you read it. Did you read it in August 8th? Did you read this letter from CAP?
I'm sure I did.
I certainly hope you did, because CAP is concerned that your Section 56 of this bill is going to shut down the oil and gas industry off Labrador. So will you, or off Newfoundland and Labrador, will you remove Section 56 from this bill to address their concerns?
So this bill was negotiated in tandem with the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, which obviously is a significant participant in enabling the offshore energy industry. It is something that we and they are fully comfortable with, and we see the bill as standing as it is. Obviously, subject to the discussion that this committee will have.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. How did you, Mr. Minister, I'd like to know how you hoodwinked the provinces in Atlantic Canada to support this legislation. How did you pull the wool over their eyes?
Well, my goodness, I have a lot more respect for Premier Furey and Premier Houston than perhaps you do. At the end of the day, both of them see this as an enormous economic opportunity. Both of us came to us to actually ask that this be done. Both of them engaged in negotiations on this. So, I mean, I can't speak for them, but I am obviously very shocked that you would actually see them as being that kind of weak in their ability to actually negotiate on behalf of their province.
I don't think they're weak leaders, but Section 56 gives you the unilateral power with the unconstitutional Bill C-69 to create marine protected areas so that you can pull development and exploration permits without an environmental impact study. In 2023, we saw a record 37 parcels of leases that were put forward off the east coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. How many of those were actually bought?
So, industrial development is important, so is the protection of biodiversity. Biodiversity is in decline around the world. It's important that we are actually protecting particularly sensitive areas. I'm not sure why the Conservative Party doesn't believe in the protection of biodiversity, but at the end of the day, you cannot, under this bill, the federal government can't unilaterally create a marine protected area or a marine refuge. It has to be done in conjunction with the province and territory.
How many, you didn't answer the question, Mr. Minister. How many blocks were sold off the east coast of Newfoundland and Labrador? in 2023? How many parcels were sold? Out of a record 37 that were offered up, how many?
How many?
I would ask, none were sold.
Zero. Bingo.
This? Zero?
After 8 years.
It was zero.
Your government.
How many $1 million worth of leases were sold in the Gulf of Mexico in that same year?
I do not know the answer to that question.
The answer? $382 million worth of leases were sold in the Gulf of Mexico. Why would these same oil and gas producers trip over themselves to drill and explore in the Gulf of Mexico and completely walk away from Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore oil and gas industry?
Look, businesses actually make decisions based on the development of the business case, and they would make their own decisions. I'm not going to put myself in the mind of an ExxonMobil or a Shell or anybody else. At the end of the day, they will make their decisions based on the overall economics of the project and their view about the future of energy.
So in June, after this legislation was tabled, there were teams from 10 major oil and gas producers that were poring over the data, and that was tabulated for all these 37 parcels of land, and they were preparing their bids. Industry sources tell me that there were 10 companies preparing bids. When this legislation was tabled, the interest waned. Why are you trying to kill Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore oil and gas industry with the fear and the instability that this legislation is presenting to our producers?
Okay, I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, at the end of the day, companies make decisions. If you actually look at the prior years to 2023, and I'm not sure if you've looked at that, there were significant purchases of bids. At the end of the day, this bill makes no significant changes to the process with respect to oil and gas. And if you think it does, you should go back and read the bill.
So thank you, Minister. Mr. Ellis, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks for being here, Minister. You know, I think it was very disappointing to hear you start the climate change rhetoric and suggesting that the Conservatives, because we have questions, are climate change deniers. You know and I know that's just foolishness. This process is designed to have questions. And the sad part is you're the person here to answer them. So your beginning rhetoric is very disappointing for the person that I've come to know. And that being said, you know, is your primary purpose here a climate crusade or is it an economic case? Because as we get into this, we know the economics doesn't exist. So which is it, climate crusade or economics?
Well, it is both. And I would say, while I enjoy our conversations in the gym, I got to call it like it is. The Conservative Party of Canada's climate plan is to let the planet burn. You cannot take any other observation away from everything that you folks oppose, from having zero interest in actually reducing emissions. It is appalling that you folks have such disregard for the future of our children and our grandchildren. At the end of the day, though, you have to fight climate change. You have to do it in a manner that is economically workable. We are doing both.
This is a Nova Scotia member of Parliament trying to ask questions about an Atlantic Canadian
Thank you, colleagues.
Legislation that
I would just ask all colleagues to give the minister, if you ask a question, just give him enough time to answer the question. And so there's appropriate balance. Mr. Ellis, the floor is yours. Please continue.
Thank you very much, Chair. And you know, I guess, Minister, I would suggest to you that I'm the one asking the questions. You're the one to provide the answers. And if I'm interrupting you, I think that that's a very reasonable thing. I'm trying to be respectful here, sir. You know, I would also suggest to you that your government's policies have driven 2 million Canadians to food banks every month. You're taxing them into oblivion. Now, if we want to talk about the business case here, what happened to the business case of tidal power?
Well, I'm not sure how much you know about tidal power, but certainly the issue that they ran into with respect to DFO was an issue about trying to figure out a pathway through which you could actually protect fish and fish habitat. But tidal power is far from commercial at this stage. It's got to come down a significant amount of cost reduction before it would be deployed on a commercial basis. So I would suggest that perhaps happy to sit down with you and have a conversation about technology, but that's not one that's ready for prime time right now.
Minister, how many fish were struck in the sustainable marine environment that they had in the Minas Basin? How many fish?
So, I mean, there were projects that were projects that were permitted. There were projects that were permitted. But as I say, we've established a working group with DFO and with the province of Nova Scotia to ensure that we're actually addressing both of those issues. We want to see renewable energy move ahead. It has to be in a manner that's consistent with the protection of fish and fish habitat.
Chair, I suggest that you need to get control of this committee. I asked one simple question. How many fish were struck? How long was that question, Chair? 10 seconds? How long was the foolish answer? A minute and a half?
Chair.
And we still don't know the answer.
That's not a point of order, that's his time.
I didn't ask a point of order.
You count that as his time, correct?
The time has been running. Colleagues,
okay,
I will stop the clock now. Colleagues, once again, if you ask a question, we want to give the minister time to answer the question. If you don't like his answer, that's your prerogative, but you ask a question. The minister's taken time to come today to answer your questions, so just give him enough time to answer the question. So I'll turn the floor back to you, Mr. Ellis.
Once again, Chair, very simple question. How many fish were struck by the Sustainable Marine Project in the Midas Basin?
I'm more than happy to ask the Department of Fisheries and Oceans for an answer to that question.
Thank you very much, Minister. Clearly you don't know. That being said, when we begin to look at the economics of the hydrogen case, which you so much you want to talk about, tell us a bit about green hydrogen and the cost to develop on a per kilogram basis. What's the cost? How many, let's say, euro per kilogram?
It totally depends on the scale. It depends on the wind speeds. It depends on a whole range of things. But look, I mean, you're from Nova Scotia. You're from Nova Scotia. There is a leading company there called Everwind that has developed a business case. They can certainly tell you what their estimate is for their cost of production. But I'm not going to give you their internal numbers. That's commercially confidential.
I would suggest, sir, that you have no idea that because you're not even calculating the capital cost, the creation cost, and the shipping cost for hydrogen, which you want to go on and talk about is such a great thing for our European partners. And we very clearly know that that is an insurmountable cost at the current time. Without your government pouring incredible...
Talk to the CEO of Everwind, who has spent $200 million of his own money developing the business case for this.
What kind of a committee is this? It's a great one. It's a poorly run one. That being said, now we have a chirping from somebody else who's doesn't even have the floor. That being said, what we know very clearly that there is no business case at the current time for shipping hydrogen in the state of ammonia. We know that. Everybody knows that around the world. But here you are saying that what we need to do here is have wind on the offshore, which could potentially interfere with many things, especially the fishery in Nova Scotia. And we don't even have a fully realized onshore wind industry in Nova Scotia. So here you are touting this business case, which your government is wont to do, telling us how great things are without any business case and without the ability to provide any numbers whatsoever as to the cost of creation of hydrogen, for example, which you want to be the crown jewel, I'll use that word.
Minister, I'll ask you for a brief comment.
How much experience you have in business, but typically the business case is developed by a company. There are companies, a number of companies in Newfoundland, Labrador, and in Nova Scotia. There are companies in Alberta and in Japan that are actually looking at the development of hydrogen and shipping it as ammonia. So, I mean, I'm more than happy to sit down and have a longer conversation about this with you, but your facts are just not facts.
Minister, I would suggest that uncertainty is being caused by a government that has not moved in 108 days to fix a piece of legislation that you yourself claim is the cornerstone of your environmental and regulatory policies. The Supreme Court said in large part was unconstitutional. And speaking of those unconstitutional sections, of course, it's section 64 of C69, that is in C49. That is in C4. I'm sure you've read C49, which is what we're talking about, so you can catch up. Which allows the minister to interfere in a project, and this is what my colleague Rick Perkins was getting at earlier, if they think it's in the public interest. There's no definition of that, and then any conditions can be created that are deemed necessary. And that is exactly what has caused uncertainty in the Canadian energy sector, driven away billions of dollars of projects and private sector proponents. And it's interesting to hear your counterpart in your government, your NDP colleague there, worrying about missing the window, when of course the example, well, now we know why he doesn't worry, but of course an example of your destruction is LNG. 18 proposals when you came to office, only 3 approved, only 1 under construction is the one that was previously approved by the Harper government. Or the fact you keep talking about China with the same admiration that your Prime Minister once confessed to, and that Canada doesn't produce any lithium for Canadian use. It actually goes to China, and we can't get critical minerals or rare earth metals out of the ground in less than 25 years in this country because of your legislation. But I'd like to ask you some more questions. Why are there no costs in this bill? Surely to expand the mandate, the roles, the responsibilities, and the critical function of the regulator to assess risks to ecology, to marine wildlife, to habitat. These are related to offshore wind technology, which is new from, rather than petroleum development in the past. That you can assure that there are no costs involved in ensuring the boards have the resources, the skill set sufficient to execute their new mandates outlined in this bill?
I'm not even sure where to begin in terms of that monologue, but there were a whole bunch of things that were just wrong in there, including the fact that there is an operating lithium mine that came on stream in Quebec that actually produces for North America, and there's another one that's actually being developed. So there's a whole range of things you said that are just factually inaccurate.
No, the production on that mine isn't for Canadian use. It gets exported to China.
No, Soyona is in Quebec. Soyona is in Quebec, and it's used in North America. It's actually, yeah. So
it's in North America, not in Canada. You got it.
So. But
that one.
What I would say is C-49 does not change the Impact Assessment Act. So I'm not sure where you're going with a lot of the things that you're actually saying.
I quoted you the section of C-69 that's in C-49. I quoted the section of C-49 that brings in that unconstitutional section from C-69, Minister.
Okay. So at the end of the day, in virtually all impact assessments, including CIA 2012, which was actually operationalized under the government of Stephen Harper, which I would suggest was a conservative government, there are decisions at the end of it which are made by democratically elected authorities.
Minister Wilkinson, can you hold for a sec? We have a point of order from Mr. Bruson.
It's just, again, it's really hard to follow when every time Ms. Stubbs is speaking over the minister. So I'm just asking, just to find a sequence to it that we're not speaking at the same time. It's making it really hard.
Thank you, Mr. Bruson, for that reminder. I think the nice sequence is we ask a question, we get an answer, and we let the individual asking the question finish, and then the individual, in this case the minister, answer the question before we move to the next one. It also is very helpful for our interpreters who are trying to interpret the back and forth. So one at a time, let's not speak over each other, and I think we'll have a smooth remainder of the meeting. Minister Wilkinson, sorry to interrupt you partway through your response, but I'll turn it back to you to respond.
I was just saying it is normal in a democratic system that democratic authorities actually have the final decision-making authority. That was true under CIA 2012, which Stephen Harper actually put into place. So I'm not sure exactly where she's going with that.
My question was cost and resourcing to the boards to execute their new
mandates.
So
the resourcing to the boards, it works in the same way that other regulatory authorities work, which is that they are cost recovered from industry. They're not paid for by the government.
So all of the execution of the new mandates imposed on the regulators by the government, you're going to get that completely from industry. Yeah,
that is the intent, in the same way that it is for the offshore petroleum, and that's the same thing for the Canada Energy Regulator.
Yeah, interesting, except that my Atlantic Canadian colleagues have just explained with proof here to you that there's no such development, and that the signal that the private sector proponent took from this bill was to bail out.
Well, I will tell you that all the work that they do with respect to bids and everything else, existing facilities, the approval of the Bay du Nord project a couple of years ago, that's all cost recovered from industry.
Pardon? Oh, good. Oh, sorry. So, Minister, in C-49, you have the same ability to end any current development by issuing in the anti-development zones. As you know, and as we've discussed frequently, Indigenous people communities are involved at extremely high levels in the energy sector and all kinds of sources of energy. In fact, energy companies are the biggest employers of Indigenous people across Canada. That's why things like the just transition will hurt them disproportionately. In your bill, like in others, you have no requirement for consultation when you cancel licenses, when as a result of invoking an anti-development zone, which you give the power to do here in C49. There's no requirement for consultation with either of those private sector proponents, but importantly, either with Indigenous communities or people who may be involved in both offshore petroleum and alternative development as equity owners and private sector proponents.
So if one was to cancel a holding for reasons of biodiversity protection or something, it can only be done in conjunction with the province. And of course, in those kinds of circumstances, you would arrive at that conclusion only after actually having consultations with a range of folks.
Thank you.
Minister, I was interested that you brought up Everwind. We had Everwind before the Finance Committee in the pre-budget consultations. And I asked the president of Everwind, I said, have you developed any science with regard to the impact of both the offshore windmill locations and the transmission cables on the ocean floor, where they want to put them in the eastern shore off of Guysborough? And he said, no, none, no science. He also said that when I asked him if he had consulted with any fishing groups in the discussion of their project, he said no. Do you believe that's an appropriate way for these organizations to operate, to propose a policy that has absolutely no science conducted in the area that they want to do on what it will do to marine species, and that they don't talk to the local stakeholders who earn a living from the sea there?
So maybe I can just explain how this works. There's a regional environmental assessment that actually is going on that will identify areas that are suitable for this kind of development and areas that are not suitable for this kind of development. Once that is done, it actually enables companies to look at some of those areas to determine if in fact they are interested in applying for the rights. In that context, the science is being done through the regional environmental assessment, and it will be done through any project-specific assessment that the company actually puts forward. And of course, the company will also be doing its own science once it actually knows where it wants to put it. But we're not at that stage yet.
I don't believe that the company has any obligation to do any of that work now before they even start proposing it. His answer to me,
until you've actually identified the areas that are suitable.
Don't interrupt me.
Well, you asked a question.
Don't interrupt me.
You asked a question.
I'm in the middle of my
order.
Question. You can't interrupt me in the middle of my
Mr.
question.
Perkins, I'll ask you to hold. Minister, if you could please hold. Colleagues, I understand question and an answer. So as we start a question, we finish a question. Let's get a complete answer. You can come back to your next question. We don't need multiple people speaking in the mics at the same time. So one at a time. Now, now we'll have the floor. Well, you asked the minister a question.
I wasn't finished.
Okay, so
and it's not for him to presume when I'm finished.
Proceed with your question.
Minister, so you think it's appropriate for a company that wants to locate, that's owned by foreign owners, to come to Nova Scotia and not talk to the local groups and not have any science? His response to my question was, there's lots of science in Scotland. We don't need to do any science.
Well, I wasn't there when he was there, and I wouldn't agree with him. If that was what he said, I wouldn't agree with that. There is science that is required. It is being developed under the regional assessment. It will be developed under a project-specific assessment. But companies, until they actually know where they are actually looking to locate, which will be the product of the regional assessment, I'm not sure what science they're going to be able to do because they're not even sure where the location is. So, yes, eventually they will need to do that. But we're not at that stage yet. We're doing the regional assessment work, which is the first step.
They know where they want to put it, so I would see that they could start that. But let's talk about the business case. You mentioned the business case, and you've been very condescending to some of my colleagues about it. I've had an extensive business background. I know you have. But you understand that if I say I'm going to invest $1 in something and the government said, that's great, I'm going to give you $1.15 back in taxpayer money for every dollar you put in, that's not a very risky situation, which is what's happening with your government. The accelerated capital cost allowance for these projects right now is 75%. And in your budget, in the fall economic statement, you put in for, in the case of green hydrogen, another 40% input tax credit. That's 115% credit that they can get for spending $1. Now, do you think without that taxpayer subsidy that is not only subsidizing all the costs but giving them a profit on the taxpayer, without that any money and capital would be coming here to do this, since it doesn't have a business case that says that it will produce wind energy at a comparable cost to the energy that we already have in our province?
So the investment tax credits don't apply just to hydrogen. They also apply to carbon capture and sequestration and a range of other things, including electricity generation. They are intended to allow us to move forward expeditiously, particularly with new technologies and technologies that are still coming down the cost curve, where it is important to actually put in place measures to stimulate that. That is not different from what governments around the world are doing. And you can have a look at what governments are doing with respect to this kind of stuff everywhere. At the end of the day, Canada intends to be a long-term player in this game, and Nova Scotia and Newfoundland intend to be a long-term players in this game.
I don't believe the projects can exist without the fact that the government is essentially nationalizing and paying for it all through the taxpayer when you've got 115% that they can get back on a dollar that they invest.
So the investment tax credit pays a portion of the capital, only a portion of the capital for a period of time. They expire at a certain period of time as we've actually got to the point where the market is more mature. We can choose to actually not pursue these opportunities and let the jobs go elsewhere and the economic prosperity. And if that's what you're suggesting, that's certainly something that you can do. But I would tell you that is not the view of every other G7 country in the world. That is not the view of the Premier of Nova Scotia. That is not the view of the Premier of Newfoundland. We believe in seizing the economic opportunities that are going to drive the economic future of Canada.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Small. Go ahead, Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the member for Labrador accused me of not supporting my province. While the production of oil, Mr. Chair, while the production of oil in Newfoundland and Labrador has dropped by half since the Liberal NDP coalition came to power. So why do you want to shut down? Don't be having that look on your face down there. Why do you want to shut down an industry that provides 30% of the GDP of Newfoundland and Labrador? Why do you want to destroy that? And what's your timeline?
I have no intention of destroying anything. I mean, at the end of the day, I work very closely with Premier Furey and his government. We have done all kinds of work across a range of files, including the oil and gas file. I certainly was involved very much in the conversations around Bay du Nord. So, I mean, that kind of an implication is just silly.
So, and then I heard the member, my friend from King's Hants, making fun of technology, not taxes. Well, you know what? Technology, not taxes, right? So natural gas is proven to produce half the greenhouse gases that coal produces. Last year, India and China set a record for coal consumption, and it's going up again. So if using natural gas is not technology instead of taxes...
Point of order?
We have a point of order from Mr. Angus. Mr. Angus, go ahead.
Well, the Conservatives interrupted me and said that I was talking about what wasn't involved. Is natural gas, are we looking at natural gas as part of this agreement? Is that something that's happening offshore in Newfoundland?
Thank you, Mr. Angus, for your point of order. I just want to make sure, colleagues, we don't use point of order for debate, but colleagues, we use our time to stay relevant to the topic at hand. So, Mr. Small, I will go back to you, and you can continue on with your line of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll give you a little education here that natural gas is one of the petroleum products that this bill is going to have power over and the development of it. So, Mr. Angus, and this point of order is a pile of baloney there. So why would you want to bring in legislation that's stopping the development of the 9 trillion cubic feet of natural gas on the Grand Banks, which would go to help and drop the greenhouse gas emissions of the world by 25%, and that's guaranteed if all coal was stopped being burned and we use natural gas instead. Guaranteed drop in world emissions of 25%. Why are you against that?
Well, first of all, that's not guaranteed. You have to actually look at the methane emissions associated with the upstream. You have to look at the emissions associated with how you liquefy the LNG before you actually ship it. So your case of half relates to Canada versus Japan, but only in the circumstance where you're actually doing things to fight climate change, which your party opposes. But at the end of the day, natural gas can be part of a transition. That is why LNG Canada 2 is being built. That is why wood fiber is being built. difficult, and certainly companies are free to bring forward, based on their assessment of the future market, projects to go through the assessment process.
Thank you. And it's great to hear you acknowledge that that natural gas can be a part of the solution. So if it's a part of the solution, and now you've come to this new reasoning and a new thought process, why did you not approve all of those LNG plants? It's just 2. There were like over 15 on the books when you came to power. So knowing what you knew, what you're saying now, you know it now. Why did it take so long to come to that to that knowledge?
Well, first of all, there's 3. And second of all, the government didn't actually turn down any of those projects, if you go back and actually look at that. So at the end of the day, the question for companies that actually are proposing LNG facilities going forward is, what is the market going to look like going forward? And what the International Energy Agency says is that demand globally for oil and for gas will peak in this decade. So you've got to take that into account in terms of whether you're going to actually have stranded assets and whether you're going to be able to pay back your capital. That's up for companies.
And you mentioned the cost to liquefy natural gas. What's the cost to liquefy hydrogen?
Not the cost to liquefy, it's the nature of how you liquefy. So you can either use natural gas to liquefy, or you can use electricity to liquefy. But if you use natural gas, the emissions are much higher, and therefore you're not actually gaining a lot when you're displacing coal.
How much more time is left, Mr. Chair?
30 seconds.
Oh my God, thank you very much. That's wonderful. So going back, right out of the gate, Minister, you talked about your consultations with stakeholders. So when did you consult with the FFAW, which is the largest fishing industry stakeholder group in Canada? On what date was it?
I will ask my officials in terms of the date, but there were 2 collective organizations, one of which the FFAW is part of, that were
well, I can tell you, you did not consult with them, because I asked them if you did. You did not consult with them.
Well, I'm happy to take that away, and and look at what the dates were, but I'm pretty sure the department actually did.
What about
Thank you, Mr. Small. Thank you. The time is up.